Alright, so one of the biggest issues people have with football is competition. It's probably the thing people complain about the most, actually, and it's not hard to see why. Bayern have won the Bundesliga an absurd 11 times in a row. Everybody calls it a farmers league now, and nobody really takes it seriously. Even seasons like this, where Leverkusen are leading an exciting title race, a lot of people aren't tuning in because they think Bayern will win anyway. La Liga has been dominated by Madrid and Barcelona since the 50s, but recently it's got even worse. At least before, in like the 70s and 80s and 90s, you would have the occasional Atletico Madrid or maybe a Valencia or Sociedad here or there. Since 2004 though, there's only been two La Liga winners outside of Madrid and Barcelona, and that was Atletico Madrid a couple times. PSG has won League One like 9 of the last 11 seasons. A few years back, Juventus won the Serie A like 9 straight times, even though in very recent years, it's been one of the more competitive leagues. Even the Premier League, which is widely viewed as the best and most competitive league in the world, has had Manchester City win 5 of the last 6 titles. Football fans are pretty used to it, but from an outside perspective, it looks hella abnormal. Take a look at the NBA, for example. There's been 11 different champions in the last 20 years, and yes, there's been teams that dominated for periods of time, but the last time you've seen a team just run off 7 or 8 titles in a row, it was still segregated water fountains. I think the only time you could really just assume who the NBA champions were going to be before the season even started was after KD joined the Warriors, and even that only lasted 3 years. Plus, they lost the finals that last season because of injuries. Same goes for the NFL. There's been 13 champions in the last 20 years, and there's never really been a time where the league was constantly topped by the same team consecutively. The closest we've came in the last couple of decades is the Patriots, and even their 6 titles in that time were spread out pretty well over those 2 decades. In the NBA, you usually have about 10 teams that are actual contenders for the title, and another 8 or so teams on top of that could be considered average to decent or good out of 30 total. While there are a few teams that seem to always be contenders, there are plenty of teams that drop in and out of the contender category as years pass. Some years they're ass, then they turn it around for a few years, and suddenly they're good for a while. Basically, the point of that whole intro is that there's more variety. So what's the difference? Well, there's 2 major things that keep the NFL and NBA more consistently competitive than most European football leagues: a salary cap and a draft. As a result, a lot of American fans of football ask why Europe doesn't adapt those into their football leagues to make it more competitive. It sounds like a simple solution, but it really isn't. I know a lot of people here might not give a fuck about American sports, so for those of you who don't know, here's how a salary cap and a draft works. The salary cap is the limit on how much a team is allowed to spend on players per season. Football does have financial fair play rules, but they're flimsy as hell. Basically, all clubs have to do is not spend more than they earn in a 3-year period. It's extremely easy for clubs to get around this, especially teams who are extremely rich and teams who have owners that own multiple clubs. A salary cap is pretty cut and dry. They calculate the number based on the league's overall revenue from the previous season, then do some kind of percentage thing and divide it up by the number of teams to come up with somewhat of an average. This season's salary cap in the NBA is $136 million. Teams are allowed to go over the cap for their total payroll to do things like re-sign their own players, but once you pass a certain point, the luxury tax, the team's got to start coughing up bread. The more and the longer you're over the salary cap, the more and more you have to pay. There is tiny loopholes that allow slight wiggle room. For example, you can't sign whoever you want when you're over the cap, but you can sign a washed up old man to a veteran's minimum if you want. Or maybe you can convince a solid younger player to take the veteran's minimum, which changes depending on how many years the player has been in the league, but usually sits between like $1 and $3 million or so. Let me put this in football terms. Let's say Manchester United was over the salary cap, but they wanted to add a DM to their team. They wouldn't be able to sign somebody like Tchouaméni because he's worth way more than a veteran's minimum contract, but they would be able to sign somebody like Sergio Busquets or Jorginho because Busquets old as fuck and Jorginho's out of his prime, so there wouldn't be any major issue with lower contracts. The idea sounds beautiful on paper. Teams wouldn't be able to just go grab whatever superstar they want and stack their teams while the broke-ass motherfuckers at the bottom of the table suffer. Unfortunately, there's a few reasons why this would literally never happen. For one thing, the NBA is the only basketball league in the world that really matters. This affects the conversation in multiple different ways. If a numerical limit was put on how much teams could spend on players in, let's say, the Premier League, top teams would suddenly have to limit the amount of stars on their team or give them considerably less money. Some of the superstars fled into the Premier League for those big contracts would suddenly start dipping off to other countries where they can make more money without any restrictions. The history of the Prem would obviously still attract some players, but money is a big factor for a lot of people. Instead of getting the overall competitiveness that would make the league more entertaining, they just lose some of their stars. Obviously, the NBA or NFL doesn't have this problem because the NBA is the only really huge basketball league in the world, and nobody gives a fuck about American football outside North America. They don't have to worry about other leagues taking their players because they don't really have competition for real. The last time there was any type of league competition in basketball was half a century ago when the ABA made a little noise, but they were broke as hell, and eventually the NBA literally swallowed them up. Took the only teams that mattered and paid the rest of them to scram. Basically, a salary cap in the top football league would really just hurt the league because a lot of the best players would just go to other leagues. Let's just be delusional for a second and say that every league somehow agreed to implement a salary cap, something that literally would never happen, but entertain me for a second. The top teams in Europe are not going to fuck with this at all. They've been blowing as much money as they want for years, building their monopoly on the football world, winning as much as they want, and most importantly, bringing in more and more money. Imagine you're PSG. A couple seasons ago, you had a payroll of 390 million euros. 390 million euros. With a reasonable salary cap, they would have had to cut that shit in half. As a matter of fact, they'd probably have to cut that down by 2/3 or so. You got Mbappe running around making 70 million a year. That would literally be half the payroll under a salary cap. Even this year, after losing both Neymar and Messi, PSG's current payroll is right under 300 million. Nobody in the entire club of PSG would fuck with a salary cap. Same goes for City, same goes for United, same goes for Bayern, same goes for Madrid. They all have absurd payrolls that are way higher than any hypothetical salary cap would be. A lot of people think the FFP rules restricted spending to make everything more fair, but really, it was more like a bunch of people finding the key to wealth, using that key to get stupid rich, and then tossing the key in the ocean so that no other poor people could find it. As long as they're bringing in just as much money as they're spending, City can keep throwing bread at the best players in the world, and so can Chelsea, United, Arsenal, and all the other big clubs. Meanwhile, even if a little club tries to become an oil club like City, they can't just throw around all the money they want because they'll breach FFP regulations. They don't have the revenue to match the spending. That's actually the reason City's being charged right now. They're being accused of inflating their revenue so that they'd be able to spend more money, and they're being accused of giving Robert Mancini a secret salary. Anyways, back to the main point. There's already been talks about all the big clubs dipping off to do their own thing just because they don't think they make enough money from the current Champions League structure. That Super League threat put so much fear in UEFA's heart that they folded immediately and started shaking shit up right away. The new UCL format starting in 2024 got an absurd number of games, and UEFA announced it during the whole Super League nonsense. The top teams threatened to rebel because they weren't making enough money, and that was all it took for UEFA to crumble like a Nature Valley granola bar. Do you know what the reaction from the big clubs would be if UEFA tried to directly control their money? They would not dare try that shit. Last time, Bayern, Dortmund, and PSG all refused to join the Super League idea, but if a salary cap was put in place by UEFA that heavily challenged the power structure, there might be some second thoughts, I'm not gonna lie. To put it simply, the huge teams can just bitch UEFA whenever they want, so they know better than to try any continent-wide salary cap. So the individual leagues will never use it, and UEFA will never use it. It all just comes down to the current system being in place for too long. You can't just have the big guys spending as much as they want for years, and then boom, suddenly you introduce a harsh limit to restrain them. It's too big of a change after too long of a time. They wouldn't accept it. While it would make the leagues more competitive if used properly, it's too late to implement it without massive outrage and probably a huge ripple effect in the entire football world, including the likeliness of a Super League being created increasing. So the salary cap is out the window. Okay, what's the other way that NBA and NFL teams keep their bottom teams from being trashed forever? The draft, of course. The worst teams in the league get first dibs on the best young players in the country. Young stars from colleges everywhere, or sometimes from overseas leagues in the NBA's case, get to enter the draft and get picked up by the shittiest squads in the nation in hopes of turning them around. Sounds great, right? Yeah, no. The problem with this is that European football players don't go through regular school like American football or basketball players. By the time the top players are 17, they get a pro contract, and then it's wraps. There's no drafting a player out of a contract. These motherfuckers are tied to clubs from the get-go. Even earlier than 17, some academy players make deals with teams that don't technically break any laws about labor, but still commit them to the clubs. Messi famously committed himself to Barcelona at 13 on a napkin. Basically, there can't be a real draft. A draft in football would be crazy as hell, though. Imagine Sheffield United drafting Nwaneri out of our U team right now. Are you dumb? I will swim to England and stop that shit myself. You got me fucked up. One-man army against 50. They're going to have to kill me before he put that pen to that paper. I swear to God. La Masia would get stripped bare. Every single year, them dookie-ass clubs from all over Europe would be snatching them kids up like white vans. Yeah, hell nah. A draft just ain't going to work in football. I'm telling you. The concept of promotion and relegation kind of clashes with a draft, too, because it's like The whole purpose of the draft is to improve the worst teams in the league, but the worst teams in the league in Europe get booted out of the league to go play with bums in lower divisions after every season. There's just too many differences in the way American sports and European football don't work the same. It's not as simple as just saying, oh, let's add a salary cap and then snapping your fingers and making it appear. Now, with all that being said, in the fantasy dream world where a salary cap was always a thing in football, would it be awesome? If you're a fan of a smaller team, then absolutely yes. You would finally get at least more of a fair shot. The salary cap is calculated based on a percentage of overall league revenue, usually around 45%, divided by the teams in the league. If we take the Prem's £5.8 billion revenue last season and do the math, the salary cap comes out to about £130 million. Only 6 teams are currently above that yearly payroll, with Manchester United first place at just over £200 million. City isn't far behind with around $200 million. In a hypothetical scenario where a salary cap and a hard cap was a thing, it would be extremely hard for them to get to that point in the first place because they wouldn't be able to keep signing new star players once they passed a certain level of money. Half the teams in the league have payrolls under £80 million. Those teams would finally be able to spend more without being restricted by their own revenue, but not spend so much that the club eventually goes bankrupt, which is part of the reason FFP regulations were put in place initially. Of course, a lot of teams will still go over the cap with things like re-signings, mid-level exceptions, and all the other little loopholes. Right now, almost every single NBA team is over the cap, actually. But at least it wouldn't just be the big teams spending, and at least they can't just buy everybody they want. It's not a fantasy world, though, so that shit ain't never gonna happen. Too much greed in the higher areas of the sport. I feel like I've been chatting for a minute. Damn, I'm gonna shut up now. Y'all have a good rest of y'all day. I'm about to take a nap. I'm tired as hell. I'm gonna catch y'all.